1989 had been one heck of a year in gaming. Not only was the Nintendo Entertainment System on fire with countless great releases, but that was also the year the Sega Genesis and the NEC TurboGrafx-16 showed up in the United States, in what would become the very beginning of the 16-bit era for me. It led into a 1990 filled with great software, some of which were among the very first Japanese titles I'd import. Something else interesting began happening that year. We started to hear more and more about the Super Famicom, Nintendo's next-generation 16-bit console that had taken Japan by storm. You kept hearing buzzwords like Mode 7, and it wasn't unusual for gaming magazines to claim it was easily the most powerful home console ever created. The hype was unreal for a console that had yet to be released. Even though I was enjoying my Sega Genesis quite a bit, I stayed glued to all the news about the Super Famicom, including its eventual Japanese launch. I don't mind telling you that even with the blurry pics available back then, I was getting pretty excited for the thing. It was clear it could display some pretty visuals, and all the talk about its sound and scaling capabilities was hard to ignore. When it eventually came stateside in 1991 as the Super Nintendo, it kicked off a 16-bit war that is still discussed to this very day. Thinking about all that got me feeling quite nostalgic about the Super Nintendo, so I decided to take a run down memory lane and talk a bit about some games I preferred playing on it. I have 10 titles that I feel looked, sounded, and played better on Nintendo's 4th generation monster. Hope you guys enjoy better on the Super Nintendo. Our first game is going to come as a surprise to many of you, but I much prefer Joe and Mac on the Super Nintendo. This originally appeared as a Data East arcade game in 1991, before being brought to the Super Nintendo as an enhanced conversion that same year. Stages were added and expanded, a world map was added, and the sound and visuals were a knockout. It kept the 2-player mode as well, making it a great early addition to that console's library. The Genesis port is a more bare-bones arcade conversion and little else. It does keep the 2-player mode, but the sound and visuals are a notable step back from the arcade and Super Nintendo releases. It isn't that it's bad, quite the contrary really. It's just there's more meat on the bone over on the Super Nintendo. There was also a huge time jump between these releases. The Super Nintendo edition was relevant because it came out when the arcade version was still fresh in gamers' minds. The Genesis port was dropped in 1994, well after the fact, making it something of an afterthought, especially with gameplay that wasn't expanded upon or upgraded in any meaningful way. Arcade purists will likely want to stay with the Genesis on this one, but for me, I'll take it on the Super Nintendo every time. Judge Dredd was a movie game based on the 1995 film starring Sylvester Stallone. It was developed by Probe Entertainment, who apparently put their B team on the Genesis version, because this is a better game on the Super Nintendo top to bottom. It doesn't look or sound bad on the Genesis, but on the Super Nintendo there's more detail, more special effects, and better color. But the real win here is in the gameplay. On the Super Nintendo you have control over your individual melee attacks. You have a jump kick. It's easier to arrest the bad guys. It's easier to crawl on uneven surfaces. And the jump feels higher and longer. All that makes the experience so much more satisfying on the Super Nintendo, and once coupled with the superior presentation, this is the one you're gonna want to play. It was one of those games that really should have been just as good on the Genesis, but it was clear that Acclaim set the Super Nintendo as the lead platform. If you have never played this one and don't already have a dog in the fight, there's no need to explore any deeper than the Super Nintendo version right here. Rock and Roll Racing was a vehicular combat game released in 1993 by Silicon and Synapse, the developer who would go on to become Blizzard Entertainment. I'm not usually a fan of isometric racers, but I have to admit the multiplayer and rocking music of this one drew me in. When it hit the Genesis, it was an excellent playing game as well, but the Super Nintendo original had better sound effects, voices that didn't cut off the music, brighter colors, and a vastly superior soundtrack. It was enough of an improvement that I'd much rather play this version when given a choice. The Genesis release does run in a higher resolution, which does give you more of the track to see, but that never hindered the Super Nintendo game at all. The focus here was the great pick-up and play mechanics that made the multiplayer a blast, and of course the classic rock music that just sounded exceptional on Nintendo's platform. Again, there's no hate for the Genesis release, it was just better overall on the Super Nintendo.
The stage is set, the green flag drops! Dredd is about to blow! Dredd fades into last! Rep fades into last!
Viper looks lost out there. Cat is dominating the race.
In 1994, an epic showdown took place on home consoles. In September that year, Mortal Kombat 2 came home courtesy of Acclaim, the ultra-violent arcade fighter that had taken the world by storm a year earlier. Everyone knows the story of the first game. When it came home, Sega chose not to censor it, allowing the blood to flow freely, and the murders to wow children everywhere. Though the Super Nintendo edition of that first game looked and sounded better, it didn't matter. Gamers had wanted the content, and only the Sega version had it. But things had changed radically in a very short amount of time, with Nintendo able to absolve themselves of any blame thanks to a mature rating on the box. It meant the Super Nintendo Mortal Kombat 2 would have everything the Sega version had. And the end result couldn't have been more striking. Not only did the visuals look closer to the arcade on the Super Nintendo, but the sound effects and music were equally impressive. In contrast, the Genesis lost voices, had radically different sound effects and music, plus the visuals took a tremendous hit in overall fidelity. They both played well, and I've seen many people say they prefer the unique music in the Sega version, so this one can be just as contentious today as it was way back then. For me, it's all about the sound effects and visuals, and it's here where the Super Nintendo wins in a pretty undisputable way. The 32X release would bring the two closer in terms of presentation, but that's another story.
Fight! Round 3, fight! Come here! Finish it. Scorpion wins. Fatality.
Sunset Riders is a true tragedy on the Sega Genesis. Based on the run-and-gun arcade game released in 1991 by Konami, it came home on a measly 4 megabit cartridge. It had half the stages and playable characters, missing voices, and different bonus levels. It was still fun, but you couldn't help but feel Konami really skimped on development. The Super Nintendo version, on the other hand, is a great representation of the arcade, and only some mild changes to the overall experience. This one came on an 8 megabit cart, sporting the correct bonus levels, all 8 stages, all 4 playable characters, and a 2-player versus mode. You felt like you got a proper port on the Super Nintendo, and as a fan of the original arcade game, that made a big difference in which one I wanted to play. Konami always changed its games on the Genesis, but this time, the changes were a detriment to the experience. That's a real shame too, because what was there was shaping up to be an outstanding conversion. Smash TV in the arcade was loud, violent, and relied heavily on its multiplayer component. It was released in 1990 by Midway, a parody of television game shows set to an ultra-violent theme. When the Super Nintendo port landed in 1992 as Super Smash TV, it was a match made in heaven. Not only did it retain that over-the-top presentation so well, but the controller almost seemed tailor-made for it. The cross-face buttons made shooting in the direction you wanted while moving incredibly easy and intuitive, and it made all the difference in the world. The Genesis game is competent enough when it comes to sound and visuals, but it just does not play as well. It's true you could break out 2 controllers so you could use 2 directional pads for movement and shooting, but this never felt anywhere near as comfortable as the Super Nintendo alternative. There's just no other way to argue this one for me. The controller alone is the reason the Super Nintendo Edition easily wins. I've expressed my displeasure in the Genesis version of Super Street Fighter II, and I'll do it again here. As an arcade conversion, it is a noticeable downgrade from the Super Nintendo release. It's hard enough to believe that Capcom couldn't improve the voices over the prior Genesis version of Special Chapion Edition, but it's downright head-scratching that they made the music so much worse. And then it was in a 40 megabit cartridge that was $70 at its release. By comparison, the Super Nintendo's Super Street Fighter II had great color, much better voices, and music that was strikingly superior. I fully understand that the differences in hardware often makes any sort of one-to-one conversion impossible, but you'd think Capcom would embrace this challenge and create something that took advantage of the Genesis. Instead, they used the same scratchy voices and made no effort to make the soundtrack stand out. Gameplay-wise, you can't go wrong with either one, and both are outstanding in this regard. But when it comes to everything else, the Super Nintendo is the clear winner thanks to a superior presentation. During my childhood, I was a tremendous fan of wrestling games. I had really enjoyed the WWF Royal Rumble games on the Genesis and Super Nintendo, and appreciated the roster differences between the two. The multiplayer of these games alone ate up hours of my time, and when WWF Raw was released in 1994, I jumped on it immediately. The problem here is that both the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of Raw were the same, right down to the wrestlers and the different match types. That left the sound and visuals as the main selling point of the two, and it's here where the Super Nintendo wipes the floor with its competitor. Visually, we get better colors on the digitized portraits, the opening cinematic, the crowd, and the in-ring action. It doesn't crush the Genesis, but it's a better looking game on the Super Nintendo nonetheless. The real knockout in this comparison comes with the music, however. The symphonic tunes on the Super Nintendo do a great job mimicking the entrance themes of each wrestler, while the FM equivalents limp along on the Genesis. Fortunately, they both play great, so if you grew up on the Genesis game, you're gonna be just fine skipping it on the Super Nintendo. Still, given the choice, it's Nintendo's platform all the way. Our next two games are examples of Konami going in different directions with the same property. First up is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters, a one-on-one fighting game released in 1993 that was completely different on the Genesis and Super Nintendo. The thing is, the two games look and sound fine. It's the gameplay and content that separates them so much. The Super Nintendo aims to give you a competent fighting engine with a robust set of moves. There's plenty of modes to explore and the characters are appealing. It isn't Street Fighter II level good in my opinion, but it's a solid, well-rounded game that looks and plays well. The Genesis version, on the other hand, was phoned in and shallow as a puddle. It has a ridiculously simple 2-button interface that only expands to 3 to include a useless taunt. In order to get the stronger versions of your punches and kicks, you have to press towards your opponent as you attack. It also has an overly aggressive AI that shreds newcomers on the easiest settings. No gradual learning curve here. You are thrown to the wolves with an unintuitive control scheme that leads to instant frustration. It's an abomination that makes the Super Nintendo version look like one of the best games ever made in comparison.
Round one, fight!
Hey, come and get me.
Our last game is another Konami property, the 1994 continuation of Rocket Knight Adventures, Sparkster. I love the original game on the Genesis. The art, the music, the sound effects, the bosses, I mean, it was a trip that still stands out as a Genesis must-play. But Sparkster was an entirely different beast that also had a Super Nintendo variant released around the same time. While both these games are highly playable, I maintain to this very day that it's a better game on the Super Nintendo. They were not developed by the same team within Konami, and this resulted in two very different experiences. I found on the Super Nintendo it looked better, especially the foreign backgrounds, and I thought the gameplay felt closer to the Genesis original. No kidding, I appreciated that they opened up the levels for the jetpack on the Genesis Sparkster, but it almost felt like it was focusing way too hard on the jetpack, and it punished you until you knew where and when to boost in every single stage. The Super Nintendo edition, on the other hand, feels more like it was positioned as a real sequel to the first Genesis game. There's still lots of boosting, but the core gameplay retains enough of the great on-foot action to find a better balance and ultimately a better experience. At least in my eyes. When I finished these games, I came away appreciating it far more on Nintendo's console. It's always interesting to hear the differing opinions on games that were similar. As you saw here a few times, it can come down to the smallest reasons why we prefer one over another. Hell, I've seen enough people in my time prefer an entire catalog of games for nothing more than the controller that came with the hardware, so nothing surprises me anymore. One of the reasons I love this generation so much was the fact that games almost always had some kind of change or hardware-specific variation to find. Even if a game was designed to be identical, the differences in music alone sometimes made one worth investigating, even if your preference lie elsewhere. The same could be true of the control, the visuals, the animation, and even the available game modes. What did you think of the games in this episode? How did they fare with you, and which version did you prefer? Let me know down in the comments what you think. I'm Sega X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.